Live from Washington, this is BBC News. Several burn injuries are reported in Colorado in what the FBI is calling a targeted terror attack, but local police say they're still investigating the suspect's motive.
A major perimeter has been set up by the Boulder police in what can best be described as a Molotov cocktail attack.
Ukraine launches a massive drone attack on Russian air bases in a campaign President Zelensky says was a year and a half in the making. At least 20 people are reportedly killed. Many more are injured near a food distribution center in Gaza. Hamas blames Israeli forces. Israel denies involvement. Hello, I'm Carl Nasman. We start with breaking news coming out of the U.S. state of Colorado. Multiple people have been injured in an attack in the city of Boulder. In just the past few minutes, the state's attorney general has called that incident a hate crime. The FBI said it was a targeted terror attack. The Bureau's director, Kash Patel, saying on X, our local agents and local law enforcement are on the scene already. We will share updates as more information becomes available. The Boulder Police Department, however, giving an update just moments ago, they said they're still working to determine the suspect's motive. They said he had been arrested and is currently in hospital with minor injuries. There was a group of pro-Israel demonstrators in the area. Police now working to determine if they were in fact targeted.
I've been in contact with our local FBI multiple times. We are in contact with them here. We are not calling it a terror attack at this point. Again, it's way too early to speculate motive. I know there's a lot out there on social media, but I ask people just to give us a little bit of patience while we work through a really complex scene. A lot of witnesses were here. We've taken them to another location to debrief them and interview them. As we do that, I think the picture will become more clear. But it would be irresponsible for me to speculate on motive this early on. We're only a couple hours into this thing.
Yeah, that was that briefing by the Boulder Police Department Chief Stephen Redfern there. That was just a few moments ago. Well, CBS News correspondent Andrew Haubner is at the scene. He filed this report.
A major perimeter has been set up by the Boulder police in what can best be described as a Molotov cocktail attack that occurred here just a little after 1:30 in the afternoon local time. Now, what we heard from witnesses that were here on site is that there was a walk, one that typically does occur on weeks. It's for the Israeli prisoners, those that were taken by Hamas in the October 7th attack that are being they're still in confinement, essentially, from those groups. Now, what happened today is that the people that do that walk every week, witnesses told us, arrived onto the Boulder Courthouse lawn, that big area right off of the Pearl Street Mall, and shortly thereafter were attacked by an assailant that was alleged to have had aerosol cans and was lighting them, throwing them at individuals. Now, there was a local business owner that we spoke to, one that owns a food cart right on the Pearl Street Mall, said he ran over with water to try and put out the burns on those individuals. Another business owner that was just off of Pine Street told us that he saw people running, screaming, trying to get away from the scene. We are told that the suspect has been apprehended, but there is still a significant scene, a significant police presence, and a significant investigation that is underway. We have overheard Boulder police talking with individuals on the edges of the crime scene, saying that this is still an evolving tactical situation, that an investigation is ongoing. You can see drones in the air that have been trying to get a full picture and scope while we were just outside of the courthouse area filming that spot before police told us to push a little bit further back as they extended that perimeter line. We could see pairs of shoes. We could see a large burn scar mark that was on the pavement, a black scar that was probably about 8 feet in length. And then they asked us to promptly step back, owners of the businesses to walk out of the area, and those that were still on the Pearl Street Mall to evacuate the area as well as the investigation continues. A command center has been set up here in town.
Yeah, that's the latest we're getting there from Boulder, Colorado. The CBS News correspondent Andrew Haubner on the scene there. You can see these live images. This is coming in from Boulder, near to where that incident took place at Boulder's Pearl Street Mall, this open-air pedestrian area where this incident took place really about in the last hour or so. And again, just to recap, multiple victims with burn injuries ranging from very serious to minor taken to hospitals across the area. Police say they do have a suspect in custody, an adult male who is also being treated for minor injuries. This is being called by the FBI a targeted terrorist attack. Local police say they still don't have a motive. There is still an investigation taking place. They said earlier during a briefing that for now they're not calling this an act of terror, but it does appear as if this suspect was in the area of a pro-Israel demonstration, and we do have reports of several people with burn injuries there. I do want to read you a statement, and this is coming in from Colorado's Attorney General, Phil Weiser. This is just being released here. He says, from what we know, this attack appears to be a hate crime given the group that was targeted, appearing to refer there, of course, to this group of pro-Israeli demonstrators. It appears that this is a group, the BBC understands, that holds a regular walk in the area in support of Israeli hostages being held in Gaza. This statement then goes on to say people may have differing views about world events and the Israeli-Hamas conflict, but violence is never the answer to settling differences, and hate has no place in Colorado. Again, you see the live images there. Several police vehicles, of course, on the scene, that police tape marking the crime scene, which is just really a few meters or so away from this view there in Boulder, Colorado, just outside of Denver in that state. Again, the FBI calling this a targeted terrorist attack. That statement came out very early on. Local officials taking a bit more of a cautious view, but you look at the backdrop, of course, taking place in the United States right now, heightened tensions over the conflict in Gaza, concern among many Jewish groups and the Trump administration itself over what they say is an uptick in anti-Semitic attacks or protests across the country. And we should mention the recent targeted killing here in Washington, D.C. This was May 21st of 2 Israeli embassy staffers. That was a shooting that took place just around the corner, really, from the FBI's headquarters here in Washington, D.C. So there are concerns, there are heightened alerts, people obviously on guard for a potential anti-Semitic attack. We don't know whether or not that's the case here. We're still waiting to hear about a motive and exact details about what took place. We do know that there is a suspect in custody there in Boulder, Colorado. Several people injured, currently being treated for their injuries in hospital. We do have a live page on this attack there in Colorado, bbc.com/news. You can get the latest updates right there. We'll be updating that throughout the day and throughout the night as we get more information on what exactly is taking place. We are expecting also another briefing from local officials in Colorado, and we will bring you that when we get it. Ukraine claims to have left more than 40 Russian bomber planes burning in one of its biggest drone attacks on Russian forces since the start of the war. This video here appears to show the attack on Russian planes. The drones were launched from inside of Russia. President Zelensky says Operation Spiderweb took more than a year and a half to plan and described it as absolutely brilliant. The scale of the operation is vast. You can look at this map. Strikes hitting at least 4 different airfields from western Russia across to Moscow, reaching the country's far east, thousands of miles from Ukraine. The operation comes on the eve of planned peace talks between Ukraine and Russia and Turkey. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams is in Kyiv. He sent us this report.
Far from Ukraine's borders, an attack of astonishing audacity. Russian strategic bombers picked off one by one by a fleet of drones. Ukraine calling this Operation Spider's Web, personally overseen by President Zelensky. One of Kyiv's boldest attacks so far, a reminder, despite Russia's overwhelming strength in numbers, that Ukraine is a resourceful, determined enemy. Sources say this took a year and a half to prepare. Dozens of drones smuggled into Russia, stored on wooden pallets, loaded onto trucks, driven to distant air bases and launched remotely. Swarms of drones picked up on social media from Siberia to the Arctic Circle. At a petrol station north of Irkutsk, a glimpse of the operation in progress. With smoke already rising behind, a drone emerges from the truck and heads off to join the attack. Moments later, another, and gunfire as police officers try to bring it down. Ukraine claims to have done a staggering $7 billion worth of damage and knocked out a third of the planes Russia uses to deliver cruise missiles.
Ми розуміємо, з ким маємо справу.
We know exactly whom we are dealing with. We will defend ourselves by every means available to us, available to Ukraine, available to Ukrainians. Not for a single moment did we want this war. We offered the Russians a ceasefire.
Earlier, a different kind of wreckage, this the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia, after the country suffered another major drone and missile attack. Elsewhere, 12 Ukrainian soldiers were killed at a training base, the head of Ukraine's land forces tendering his resignation. What chance then for another round of peace talks set to take place in Istanbul? Russian and Ukrainian delegations are expected to be there, but after 24 hours of mayhem, the omens for a breakthrough do not seem good.
Earlier, I spoke to Dr. Michael Samatauka. He's an American-Ukrainian trauma surgeon who works with the Med Global Group to train surgeons in Ukraine. Here's that conversation. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. You're there in Ukraine. What has stood out to you just in terms of what you've been seeing and how the war is impacting hospitals, doctors, and of course also civilians?
Sure. So unfortunately, the Russian army has targeted several hospitals and healthcare providers. And the overall morale, I think, in Ukraine is holding strong. There's obviously concern, but there is hope for the future and for their next generation. And I think the Ukrainian people have a tremendous resiliency. They understand the importance of winning this war.
You're there, you're training surgeons. What kinds of conditions are they working under, given that, this is a country that's been in conflict with Russia for several years now?
When the war started, trauma surgery as a profession was not really established in Ukraine. So you had gynecologists, otolaryngologists, general surgeons, thoracic surgeons, everybody who was a surgeon became a trauma surgeon. And so there was a huge shift in the need and the education for how to properly take care of war-wounded patients.
During these trainings, what are the kinds of injuries, what are the kinds of skills that these surgeons will need to be able to use, given that this really is the middle of wartime?
Well, our training courses are really collegial. We learn from them and we teach them. We go through our basic ATLS and trauma courses. We go over the basics of chemical warfare, of how to treat acute traumatic injuries, damage control, of how to minimize the extent of injury to patients, how to minimize the risks of infection, the proper care and transport of the patients. And we also learn from them what they're seeing in the field. And we try to target our education classes toward treating the injuries and the wounds that they're seeing and having to deal with, many of which are very horrific.
Yeah, if you don't mind sharing, what are some of the stories or some of the typical experiences that they've been sharing with you in terms of what they do see on the front lines?
We are seeing some white phosphorus chemical warfare. There's some concern now about other carfentanil or other drugs that are being distributed with the drones. We're also seeing a lot of extremity injuries. And the injuries that you see with drone warfare are different than what we had seen historically. One of the biggest problems here in Ukraine is that we don't have air superiority. And so patients can be in the field before they get to a trauma center or to a trauma first-line hospital for hours, sometimes even days.
Michael, you have made several trips to Ukraine. I know you've been there for several days now. How safe is it to be operating as a surgeon, as a doctor right now in Ukraine?
Well, there's obviously inherent risks because we're in a war zone. We take all the precautions that we can. But quite honestly, I worry more about what would happen if people such as myself did not come here to help. And we take all the precautions that we can. I think our organization, Med Global, does an excellent job of working and helping the Ukrainian medical community, the surgeons, and the General Ministry of Health in providing the optimal care that we can for patients in Ukraine.
Medical charities in Gaza say at least 20 people have been killed and more than 100 people injured close to a new Israeli-backed aid distribution site near Rafah. Doctors say the casualties had gunshot and shrapnel wounds. However, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which runs the site with Israeli and U.S. backing, says reports of injuries and deaths were completely false. The Israeli military says it, quote, did not fire at civilians while they were near or within the distribution site. Israel doesn't allow the BBC and other international media to report on the ground in Gaza. We do rely on trusted local freelancers sending in footage. Lucy Williamson has more from Jerusalem.
They left their tents last night because their stomachs were empty. How much more painful to nurse an empty heart. By dawn, Gaza's Nasser hospital was inundated with casualties. Hungry people shot near Rafah as they waited for an Israeli-backed distribution site to open.
Let the whole world see what the Israelis and what America is doing to us. They are lying. They said they'll give us aid and they kill us. They were shelling us and shooting at us.
This video, filmed by a witness, shows people carrying aid past bodies on the ground. He said tanks had fired warning shots before dawn as the crowd grew unmanageable. Then, as the chaos grew, troops fired into the crowd itself. The Israeli-backed group behind the site sent this video from just after 5 a.m. saying the claims of casualties were false and fabricated. An Israeli soldier in Rafah told us only warning shots had been fired. Israel's army denied it fired at civilians near or within the distribution site and shared this drone footage from a different location, which it says shows armed individuals firing at Gazans as they grabbed looted humanitarian aid.
Hamas is doing his best, is almost to stop us from doing so. He is spreading rumors, fake news. He is trying bluntly and violently to stop the people of Gaza from reaching those distribution centers. We will investigate each and one of those incidents and each and one of those allegations.
Doctors described a tsunami of casualties this morning, many with gunshot and shrapnel wounds. One international medic said they were running out of tranquilizer, dressings and chest tubes.
These are all civilian casualties that were asked to go to an aid center to collect food and ended up presenting with gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds. Most of them are critical. Some of them arrived dead on arrival because of severe targeted gunshot wounds to the head and the thorax.
Today, survivors cursed Hamas as they carried the bodies. Israel's critics say it's using hunger as a weapon of war. But even by those with weapons themselves, Gaza's hungry are being treated as a threat. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Jerusalem.
We want to return now to that breaking news coming out of the U.S. state of Colorado. Multiple people have been injured in an attack in the city of Boulder. The state's attorney general calling that incident now a hate crime. The FBI saying it was a targeted terror attack. We do want to say the Boulder police saying they are still working to determine the suspect's motive. They said that an adult male has been arrested, is currently in hospital being treated for minor injuries. There was a group of pro-Israel demonstrators in the area. Police are working to determine if indeed they were targeted in this attack. Let's get more. We can bring in Ken Gray, Distinguished Lecturer of Homeland Security, Emergency Management, and Criminal Justice at the University of New Haven. He's also a former FBI Special Agent. Great to have you on the BBC. What's your assessment at this point? And obviously, we're still waiting for some details to come in here, but how do you view that situation there in Boulder, Colorado?
So Chief Redfern said that it was too early to tell. However, it's clear that this adult male, white adult male, was hurling something that appeared to be Molotov cocktails at people there in the area of the courthouse, out on the mall area there. It could be a hate crime. It could be an act of terror. It really depends upon what he said along with his actions. But I personally think it does fall into the category of him being a violent extremist, probably a homegrown terrorist. However, it is a little early to make that determination.
Yeah, and of course, there are some videos currently circulating on social media. We're working to verify those, but in some of those, you can see some of the details you were describing there. I do want to ask you, because this is something that stands out. Only a few moments, really, after we started getting these reports in, we heard from the FBI Director Kash Patel calling this a targeted terror attack. Even before, really, local police were willing to give this any sort of label. What do you make of that and the speed with which we've heard the FBI already labeling this an act of terror?
If they identify the individual and have some history with him, then they can make that determination very quickly. So it really depends upon what information the Bureau had at the time that they made that call. But you got to think back to New Year's Day, where the determination was initially said that the attack there in New Orleans was not terrorism, and then immediately reversed. I think the Bureau is a little bit gun shy after that.
Interesting. And just in terms of your experience, how common is it to see the FBI come out and make that distinction that this is an act of terror, even before you get a briefing from local officials, for example?
So I'm thinking back to the sniper attack there in Las Vegas. Initially, that was said to be terrorism, but then no motive was ever determined in that particular case. So that was walked back to not be an act of terrorism. It really depends upon the motivation. The Bureau seems to be very quick on this, so they may very well have had information about this guy prior to this act.
Of course, this attack taking place in an area where there was this group of pro-Israel demonstrators, a group that holds a walk in support of the Israeli hostages being held in Gaza. It also comes amid this backdrop, doesn't it, of increased tensions in the country. Just a couple of weeks ago here in Washington, a targeted killing of 2 Israeli embassy employees. Do you think that these sorts of things will factor in to any sort of investigation?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure that the Bureau is on high alert all around the country ever since the shooting there in Washington, D.C. So this may be yet another one of those acts like this here, somewhat of a copycat, not exactly a copycat, but a similar type of event that may have sprung from this, or it may have been the person in question here acting on their own based upon the changes right now with Hamas talking about negotiations with Israel. So I think in reality, as far as this individual act goes, he's going to be prosecuted for the use or the alleged use of Molotov cocktails. Whether it's a hate crime or an act of terrorism really doesn't make that big a difference.
I wanted to ask you, because this is a question that actually was brought up during the press conference, one of the journalists asking the chief of police there in Boulder, Colorado, whether they would consider heightened security in the future for these types of events, for pro-Israeli demonstrations taking place. Do you think that that's something that authorities, on the local level, state level, federal level, might start to look at going forward when we see similar events that have to do with that war taking place in Gaza, either on the pro side or the pro-Palestinian side?
So, it depends upon what the threat nature is at the time. If there is information that shows there is a heightened threat, I think that that may be a good justification for increased security. But nonetheless, this all it comes down to dollars and cents as to how much security, additional security, you're going to provide for events like this.
Just before I let you go, the police also mentioned, I believe, that there's a vehicle on the scene that they are investigating. We know that there's some videos that have been posted online. What kinds of clues, what kinds of things do you think the FBI will be looking at as this investigation continues to go forward?
It's not going to be limited to his car, but they'll get a search warrant for his car, search his car. If they can identify where he lives at, there's going to be a search warrant for his home. There'll be, if he has any type of computer or electronic media, there'll be search warrants for the phone and for computers to try to determine who this person is and what motivated them. So there's going to be a lot more investigation in this event.
Just briefly, again, coming back to that declaration by the FBI, really very soon after this incident took place, calling this a targeted terror attack. You mentioned that these things can be murky. We've seen some of these declarations either reversed or added on after the fact. How damaging potentially do you think it could be if this turns out to not be the way that the FBI is currently describing it?
So with an act like this, when you have logical pieces that fit together, you can presume it's terrorism. And then when it turns out not to be, walk it back. But there's a presumption there that when you have certain elements that come together, that it's more likely than not to be terrorism. As far as domestic terrorism goes, domestic terrorism is a definition. It is not elements of a crime. And so you prosecute on whatever the crime is, even though it might be domestic terrorism.
All right, Ken Gray, a former FBI special agent, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your perspective. Before we go, I just want to read a statement. This is coming from the Jewish community there in Boulder, Colorado. They say, our hearts go out to those who witnessed this horrible attack and prayers for a speedy recovery to those who were injured. They go on to say, when events like this enter our own community, we are shaken. More on that developing news coming up on BBC News.